The dawn was supposed to break at 5:12 a.m., but when the first sliver of sunlight should have touched the horizon, nothing appeared. The villagers of North Hampstead lifted their tired eyes toward the east, waiting for that familiar wash of gold to brush the fields. Yet all they saw was a cold, bruised sky, thick, swollen, and darker than any early morning they had ever known. The roosters crowed into a darkness that did not recede. The lanterns flickered in the damp wind as if preparing to be snuffed out by something unseen. It felt as though the world had quietly slipped into a strange twilight, neither night nor day, a suspended moment where nature hesitated between remembering and forgetting the rules that had governed it since time began. And this, right here, is where our journey begins. Inside a year when the world woke up to a sky that refused to brighten, when the familiar rhythm of the seasons collapsed, and when humanity found itself staring into a chilling uncertainty. Welcome, viewers, to this dark and forgotten chapter of history. If you enjoy exploring these grim stories of the past, I invite you to join our community and subscribe. Your support helps us continue uncovering these eerie events from the shadows of time. If you like this introduction, don't forget to subscribe. The villagers were unsettled long before the strange weather arrived. Winter had lingered too long, clinging to the valleys and forests like a stubborn ghost unwilling to leave. Snowbanks towered where spring flowers should have bloomed, and river ice groaned under the strain of thawing too slowly. The elders whispered that something beyond human understanding was about to unfold, a disturbance so immense that ordinary signs no longer made sense. By April, the birds returned late from migration, arriving thinner and quieter. They hopped nervously along the barren ground, searching for the insects that usually swarmed by this time of year. There were none. Even the insects themselves seemed to sense the shift before humans did. Early May brought a brief moment of hope. A warm breeze swept across the hills, melting the last remains of winter. Villages shed their thick coats and ventured into their fields. Farmers planted their seeds with desperate optimism, believing that the worst had passed. For a single week, the sky cleared and sunlight kissed the earth with the promise of renewal. But the hope was fragile, too fragile, and it shattered the moment an unnatural chill crept back into the mornings. The warmth faded as quickly as it had arrived. The first frost struck on May 15th, a cruel and silent intruder slipping into the fields overnight. Farmers awoke to a glittering sheath of ice covering their tender seedlings. Crops that should have been thriving were instead limp, blackened, and dead. Livestock refused to graze, sniffing the frostbitten ground with confusion. Mothers bundled their children as though winter had returned, though the calendar insisted it was nearly summer. People gathered in their doorways, squinting at the horizon, searching for an explanation in the dull gray that blanketed the sky. But the sky offered none. It loomed heavy with a strange darkness that looked neither like storm clouds nor nightfall. It felt thicker, deeper, as if the heavens had been muddied by something drifting far above where eyes could see. Days passed, each one colder and dimmer than the last, until villagers began lighting lamps at noon just to read or work. Travelers arriving from neighboring regions carried the same unsettling stories: fields failing, animals acting strangely, people speaking of a strange haze that wrapped the world like a veil. June arrived, but summer did not. Instead, snow fell, thin at first, like a light dusting of powdered glass. The children ran outside to catch the flakes before realizing how wrong it felt for snow to fall when the earth should have been warm. The cold deepened and the snow grew heavier. Farmers tried to salvage what little remained of their crops, but each new frost reduced their hopes to ash. People felt as though the world had slipped into a season that had no name, a season born from some colossal, invisible force. By the third week of June, the sky turned an unsettling shade of copper. Even the bravest citizens felt a tremor of fear at the sight of it. Travelers from the coast claimed that the sunsets were blood red, lingering like open wounds across the horizon. Sailors said the sea reflected those colors, turning the water thick and metallic. It was as if something massive and terrible had altered the sky itself, staining the world with a color that warned of unseen danger. Local scientists attempted explanations. Some insisted it was merely a cold spell, unprecedented but not impossible. Others blamed sunspots or shifting winds or distant storms. Preachers, sensing the growing fear, warned of divine punishment and urged repentance. Farmers, however, cared little for theories or sermons. They watched their fields die a little more each day. Families gathered around tables with thinning meals, slicing bread thinner, rationing grain tightly, anxiously calculating how long their supplies might last if the sun did not return. But even those fears paled compared to what happened next. Animals began acting unnerved, as if responding to something beyond human perception. Horses reared at shadows, dogs howled at dusk for no apparent reason. Chickens refused to lay eggs, cows produced less milk, bees vanished from the hives. People started to wonder whether nature itself was unraveling. They whispered in hushed tones about omens, spirits, or curses, anything to make sense of the uncanny silence that hung over the land. The nights grew colder still, biting through even the thickest blankets. People huddled around hearths, listening to the wind moan through the trees. The forests crackled with an unnatural dryness. Streams froze at odd hours, melting slightly in mid-afternoon only to freeze again before nightfall. No one could remember seeing such erratic behavior in the earth. But worst of all was the sky, its darkness deepening each week until the sun's light felt thin, filtered and weak, like a candle flame fighting through dense smoke. It was around this time that travelers brought word from faraway lands, rumors of bizarre conditions spreading not just in one region, but everywhere. Snowstorms in June in New England, violent thunderstorms hammering Europe, frost crippling farms in China, monsoon rains faltering in India. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not an isolated disturbance. It was global, vast, and beyond human control. Something immense had awakened. This chapter of history, The Year Without a Summer, did not begin with a single tragic moment, but rather with a slow, creeping dread that wrapped itself around the world. It was a disaster born not of war or disease, but of nature itself rebelling in ways humanity had never seen before. People lived day to day, watching the sky, hoping for warmth, praying for sunlight, clinging to the fragile idea that the earth would eventually remember how to be itself again. But deep beneath the surface of the world, in the layers of the atmosphere that only the boldest scientists dared to imagine, a silent force was moving, one that had been unleashed a year earlier on a remote island far from these quiet fields. No one in these villages could have guessed that a single explosion, happening thousands of miles away, had set the stage for the dark year they were now living through. Yet the truth was already in motion. The sky was darkened for a reason. The seasons were collapsing for a reason. The cold was returning for a reason. The world simply didn't know it yet. And as the days continued to dim, as the summer that never arrived slipped into an early echo of autumn, the unsettling reality settled in. This was not just a failure of weather or a passing anomaly. It was the beginning of something far more profound, a chain reaction that would touch every corner of the earth before it was done. The first whispers of hunger, fear, and uncertainty had already begun. Soon they would grow into cries that echoed across nations. The sky had turned black, and humanity was about to discover the price of living beneath it. A year before the strange frosts and copper skies, long before farmers in distant lands watched their fields die under summer snow, there was only an island, a mountain, and a restless quiet that no one yet understood. On the map it was a small place in the Dutch East Indies, known to traders and colonial officials, but irrelevant to nearly everyone else. To the people who lived beneath its shadow, however, the mountain was alive. It had a name, Tambora, and a temper that legends warned against. Long before any scientist would measure its height or examine its rocks, it had already earned a reputation as a being rather than a mere pile of stone. For many years, Tambora slept. Dense forests wrapped its slopes in green, and villages clung to its lower flanks, secure in the belief that the earth above them had settled into a permanent calm. The soil was rich, dark, and generous, the legacy of eruptions forgotten by time. Crops grew thick and fast. Palm trees and bananas flourished. Smoke might curl occasionally from the summit, a faint reminder of buried fire, yet most days the sky above the mountain was clear. The people learned to live with that faint warning, the way sailors live with the taste of salt in the air. It was simply a part of their world. Then, quietly at first, Tambora began to stir. In 1812, unusual rumblings were felt, distant and dull. A low mutter would roll through the ground, unsettling animals and causing cups and bowls to tremble. Thin plumes of ash slipped from the crater like exhaled breath. People watched the summit with wary eyes, but returned to their routines each time the shaking faded. Seasons passed. The mountain grumbled. Life moved on. The earth often complained without doing anything worse, or so they told one another. By early 1815, something had changed deep inside the mountain. The magma chambers, hidden miles below the surface, were filling with molten rock, gas, and pressure. Cracks widened inside the earth, invisible but deadly. Superheated gases searched for a path upward, pressing against rock that had held fast for centuries. It was a hidden war between stone and fire, each passing week tightening a force that no human eye could see. Above these unseen struggles, villages went about their work. Children played. Traders moved along the coasts. Smoke rose peacefully from cooking fires, unaware that far beneath their feet a cataclysm was gathering. On the island, the air began to smell different. A sharp metallic tang drifted down from the mountain. Fine grains of ash occasionally dusted the leaves, clinging to the surfaces of plants like gray pollen. People brushed it from their clothes, annoyed but unconcerned. There had been small eruptions before and life had gone on, yet this time the ash did not fully stop. It appeared, vanished, then returned more heavily. Another rumble rolled through the hills. Dogs paced uneasily. Birds flew in irregular patterns, abandoning nesting sites. The mountain was calling a warning for those able to hear. In April 1815, the warnings ended and the event began. On one early evening, Tambora exhaled with more force than before, sending a column of ash thousands of meters into the air. The sound traveled across the sea like a cannon blast, startling sailors who glanced toward the horizon. Some believed a battle was underway beyond the visible edge of the water. In the nearby settlements, residents looked up to see the sky above the mountain darken prematurely, stained by a rising pillar of black and gray. Ash began to fall more heavily. The rumbling deepened into a roar that did not fully stop.
For days, the mountain produced intermittent explosions, each one sending plumes higher than the last. Lightning crackled within the rising clouds of ash, illuminating the swirling horror like flickers in a nightmare. Rock fragments, pumice, and ash rained down on the surrounding area. Fields were buried. Roofs sagged under the accumulating weight. People coughed as fine particles filled the air, turning each breath into a struggle. Ocean waves, disturbed by the violence, began to behave strangely along the coasts. Yet still, no one had seen the worst. The earth was only clearing its throat. The final, catastrophic eruption arrived in the evening of April 10, 1815. When Tambora truly opened, the world around it was transformed in moments. The summit tore itself apart in a titanic explosion that dwarfed any memory or legend. The sound alone was so massive that it traveled across islands and seas, heard thousands of kilometers away as a deep, inexplicable thunder. People in distant settlements thought warships were exchanging fire. Others believed the world itself had split. From the torn mountain burst a column of ash and gas so tall and dense that it pierced the sky, punching deep into the stratosphere. At its core, temperatures raged beyond imagination. Glowing fragments of rock shot upward, then fell back in searing showers. Superheated gas raced outward, hugging the ground in deadly waves called pyroclastic flows. These incandescent clouds rolled down the slopes at terrifying speed, swallowing forests, villages, and everything alive in their path. Within minutes, entire communities disappeared. Bodies, homes, and histories were buried under torrents of ash and pumice. Night fell upon the island, but it was no ordinary night. The ash cloud blotted out the moon and stars, creating a darkness so absolute that it felt as if the sky itself had been erased. The air turned into a suffocating mix of dust and poison. People struggled to move, to breathe, to find one another. Those who survived the first blasts found themselves in a world stripped of sound except for the relentless fury of the mountain and the breaking of trees as burning flows shredded the landscape. Tsunamis rose along the coasts as the force of the eruption displaced enormous volumes of water. Waves crashed into nearby shores, sweeping away boats, huts, and unsuspecting inhabitants. In the surrounding seas, pumice stones floated by the millions, forming ghostly rafts that drifted with the currents. The magnitude of the event could not be contained to the island. Even as people screamed, prayed, or fell silent in shock, the eruption began changing the face of the earth on a planetary scale.
The ash climbed higher and higher, forming a mushroom-like plume that spread outward in all directions. At these altitudes, winds were strong and indifferent. They caught the fine particles and carried them across continents and oceans. Microscopic fragments worked their way into the upper atmosphere, forming a veil that no one on the exploding island could see, but which would soon make itself known to farmers in Europe, laborers in America, and villagers in Asia who had never heard the name Tambora. As the eruption raged, the mountain itself shrank. The once towering peak collapsed inward as its insides were emptied, forming a vast caldera. Where there had once been a proud summit, there was now a gaping wound in the earth. The forests below were flattened, burned or buried. Rivers were choked with ash. The ground lay hidden under meters of gray. When the eruption finally began to subside after days of violence, it left behind a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Those who survived in the surrounding islands emerged into an eerie silence. Ash muffled every step and swallowed sound, creating a world where voices felt small and distant. The sun remained hidden behind a thick haze, its light reduced to a dim, ghostly glow. The air smelled of sulfur and death. Wells were contaminated. Fields were unusable. Survivors stumbled through the ruins of their lives, searching for food, water, and any sign that the nightmare might be ending. The numbers lost in those first days were staggering, entire populations wiped out in seconds. Yet even in their grief, the survivors could not know that the mountain's reach extended far beyond them. In the days following the eruption, weather patterns began to shift. Winds carried the newly formed veil of ash and sulfate particles around the planet. These particles, suspended high in the stratosphere, were too fine to fall quickly. Instead, they scattered and reflected sunlight, dimming the brightness that reached the Earth's surface. The planet, without understanding, took on a fainter glow. Wherever that veil spread, the rules of weather began to twist. The oceans absorbed slightly less warmth. Land cooled more quickly at night. Temperature gradients shifted. Storm tracks wavered. The planet's delicate balance was being slowly pushed off center by a mountain that had injected its innermost fury into the sky. The eruption of Tambora was not simply a local tragedy. It was a trigger that set in motion a planetary chain reaction. Months after the eruption, ships traveling through distant waters noted peculiar sunsets. The horizon burned with strange, vibrant colors, bands of crimson, orange, and violet so intense they seemed almost unreal. Painters tried to capture these skies on canvas, baffled and enthralled by the spectral beauty. To sailors, the sunsets were ominous, as though the sky itself had been bruised. The connection to a remote mountain in the East Indies was not yet understood, but the evidence was already written in light. In Europe, some observers noticed that the summer of 1815 felt cooler, less predictable. Crops were irregular, but most people chalked it up to bad luck or ordinary variability. Scientists, still developing the tools to understand global systems, lacked the means to trace the cooling back to a single event. The idea that a volcano could darken the world was too large and too distant for most minds to grasp. While the world fumbled for explanations, the stratospheric veil remained. Winter came and went, and still the particles lingered, circling the globe. The planet was being prepared, quietly and inexorably, for the year when the summer would fail to appear. The ground, water, and air were all subtly shifted by this traveling cloak of dust and gas. The sun above remained the same, burning with unwavering intensity, but its light reached the earth weakened, diffused by the debris Tambora had thrown skyward in its fit of rage. In the villages that had once sat peacefully at the foot of the mountain, nothing remained as it had been. New stories began to circulate among the survivors, tales of a night when the world turned to fire and ash, of a roar that seemed to tear open the heavens, of a darkness that felt thick enough to touch. Grief shaped these narratives, but so did a dawning realization that they had witnessed something unprecedented. They carried the memory forward, their accounts spreading across the islands, reaching colonial administrators, clergy, traders, and eventually written records. These stories formed the human layer of the event, filled with loss, fear, and attempts to impose meaning on a disaster without mercy. Yet beyond emotion, beyond memory, Tambora's true legacy was unfolding on a scale far greater than personal experience. The eruption had injected so much material into the atmosphere that it altered the climate of the entire planet. It had effectively dimmed the sun without touching it, creating a fragile, artificial winter that would drape itself over the world in months to come. By the time spring approached in 1816, most of those who would suffer from Tambora's wrath had never seen the volcano, never heard its name, and never felt its ash beneath their feet. They were farmers in distant valleys, families in crowded cities, shepherds in the hills, merchants in coastal towns. They were people who lived by the seasons, trusting that winter would yield to spring, that spring would ripen into summer, that harvest would follow growth. They did not know that a mountain had interfered with this ancient rhythm. Yet the sky knew. The upper atmosphere still carried the mountain's breath, a ghostly remnant of the eruption drifting across the globe. The stage was set. The ashes of Tambora waited above, poised to bend the light of the coming year, to twist its temperatures, to wither its crops. The mountain, silent again and stripped of its former height, stood as a wounded giant in the East Indies, its work seemingly done. But in truth, its greatest impact was only beginning. The explosion had already happened. The sound had already faded. What remained was the echo, not through the air, but through time itself. That echo would be felt not as a noise, but as a chill. It would creep into soil, water, and bone. It would turn summer into a stranger, replace warmth with frost, and transform ordinary hunger into famine. The sun would rise as always, yet the world would look up and find it weaker, as if something vast and unseen had stolen part of its strength. The people who lived through the year without a summer would never see Tambora, but they would live under its shadow. Every withered field, every empty granary, every desperate journey for food would trace its origin back to that mountain's violent awakening. In a single, apocalyptic moment, Tambora had blown apart not just its own summit, but the invisible boundary between local disaster and global consequence, sending its dark fingerprint into the sky and into the future of every nation beneath it. The world entered 1816 expecting the familiar turn of the seasons, unaware that the sky above had been rewritten. In the early days of spring, the air felt uncanny, as though winter had been disturbed rather than ended. People woke to mornings muted by a dim light that seemed to filter through a veil. The sun was there, yet not entirely present, its warmth dulled, its face diffused behind something that refused to drift away. Farmers examined the sky with narrowed eyes, troubled by its unfamiliar pallor, but convinced that the weather would eventually correct itself. Weather always corrected itself. Their confidence was innocent, hopeful, and profoundly mistaken. The first hints of disruption arrived like whispers. A chill lingered too long in the mornings, forcing people to keep their hearths burning even on days traditionally mild. Frost, which should have been banished by spring, clung stubbornly to rooftops and fences. Pond ice melted reluctantly, with crackling edges that suggested winter had not fully loosened its grip. Birds hesitated in their flights, as if confused by the cold air meeting them where warmth should have been rising. Yet the frost was merely a forewarning, a symptom of a shift far more drastic than anyone imagined. By late April, the skies had taken on a muted gray that rarely brightened. Even midday sunlight seemed strangely weak, casting shadows without strength. People compared the light to that of a solar eclipse, not dark enough to frighten, but dim enough to unsettle. Travelers moving along country roads noticed that the horizon often looked blurred, as if dust hung perpetually in the atmosphere. Some believed distant storms were gathering. Others suspected fires in faraway forests. No one imagined the real cause was floating invisibly above multiple nations, wrapped around the world like a thin shroud. When May arrived, the change could no longer be dismissed as a passing anomaly. Warmth made brief, teasing appearances only to vanish overnight. Villagers planted their crops hesitantly, unsure whether the cold would relent, but desperate to maintain the annual cycle that kept societies alive. Seeds went into the ground, but the soil felt colder than it should. Even under clear skies, a rigid chill clung to the earth. Growth was stunted from the beginning, as though the plants sensed a threat that humans could not yet name. Then came the frost, sharp, sudden, and devastating. On May 26th, one region after another awoke to fields sparkling as though winter had returned. Corn shoots, wheat sprouts, and potato greens all lay limp against the frozen ground, blackened and ruined. Entire harvests were destroyed overnight. Farmers stared at their ruined fields in disbelief, their hopes collapsing into a numb silence. They tried replanting, but the cold persisted. Each new frost carved away another layer of expectation. It was becoming clear that the seasons had been forced off their axis. And then, the atmosphere broke away from all logic. June, the month synonymous with warmth and growth, opened with a snowstorm. The snow fell lightly at first, drifting down like an early winter flurry. Children rushed outside to marvel at it, laughing with the innocence of youth. Yet the adults felt the dread immediately. Snow had no business falling in June. It was not a moment of wonder. It was a warning. The sky remained overcast, heavy with low-hanging clouds that moved sluggishly as though weighed down by something unnatural. Soon, temperatures plunged below freezing. Rivers crusted with ice. Livestock shivered in their stalls. Frostbite cases appeared in places where such injuries were unheard of in summertime. Across the northern hemisphere, the weather became erratic and violent. Sudden hailstorms battered crops already weakened by frost, tearing leaves apart and flattening young stalks. Thunderstorms erupted with frightening intensity, turning afternoons into darkness. Rain fell thick and murky in many places, carrying traces of volcanic fallout that stained clothes, roofs, and water barrels. People spoke of dry fog, a strange atmospheric haze that dulled the sun, even on cloudless days. It had no smell, no taste, but lingered like an unseen presence. Travelers reported that distant objects appeared distorted, as if viewed through smoke. Europe saw temperatures swing wildly. One day would feel like autumn, the next like a frigid winter morning. Snow fell across Switzerland, France, Germany, and other regions that should have been enjoying warm breezes and blooming fields. Reports came of frozen vineyards, wilted vegetable gardens, and barren orchards. The terrain looked confused, unable to decide what time of year it was. Rivers swelled and shrank in unpredictable cycles as unusual weather patterns drove storms into regions unprepared for them. In New England, the situation was equally strange. June 6th became infamous for a cold snap so severe that ice formed in lakes and ponds thick enough to support light white objects. Farmers rose before dawn expecting to tend to early summer fields, only to step outside and find snow covering the ground. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Farmers burned wood desperately, trying to save what few seedlings remained. But no amount of heat could fight a cold that arrived without reason, lingered without mercy, and vanished without explanation. Nature's rhythms, those ancient, reliable cycles that guided planting, migration, and survival, were unraveling. Birds altered their paths. Insects died off or failed to hatch, leaving ecosystems silent where they should have been vibrant. Trees leafed out, only to have their foliage killed repeatedly. Wild animals wandered into villages in search of food, confused by a landscape that no longer provided what instincts told them should exist. People began to talk. Some insisted that the sun itself was weakening, perhaps nearing the end of its life. Others invoked divine anger or apocalyptic omens. A few remembered rumors of a distant volcanic event months earlier, but dismissed the idea that something so far away could influence their daily lives. The truth, however, was unfolding above their heads every day. Sunlight was being reflected away by particles suspended high in the stratosphere. The upper atmosphere, normally clear, was cloaked in a thin global veil that bent and scattered light into strange, eerie colors. The effects of this cloak were subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. Temperatures dropped globally, enough to disrupt plant growth, but not enough to freeze oceans. Winds shifted in unpredictable patterns. Moisture evaporated less efficiently, altering rainfall in ways no one understood. Regions that relied on predictable weather patterns found themselves caught in cycles of drought, flood, or both. Farmers were the first to feel the consequences, but soon the effects spread into every aspect of life. The visible signs of a global anomaly became impossible to ignore. The sunsets glowed with exaggerated hues, deep purples, fiery reds, and bands of orange that lingered unnaturally long. Painters tried to capture them, and some succeeded, leaving behind visual records of a sky distorted by atmospheric ash. Yet beauty did nothing to comfort those who watched their livelihoods unravel. As summer continued its strange course, the impact deepened. Crop after crop failed. Replanting efforts were futile. Grain stores dwindled. Livestock grew thin. Families faced the future with a gathering dread. The world was sliding toward hunger, not a local famine or a regional shortage, but a widespread scarcity that touched nearly every continent touched by agricultural life.
This was the moment when people began to realize the truth. The weather was no longer something they could predict, endure, or understand. It had slipped out of the patterns that had governed human existence for thousands of years. Something colossal had reached into the atmosphere and twisted it, leaving humanity to face a reality where winter could erupt into summer and snow could fall in June. Nature had lost its mind, and the survival of entire nations depended on whether the weather would remember itself before it was too late. But the skies were preparing yet another blow. The confused storms, the frosts, the dimmed sunlight, these were only the beginning. Soon the world would face famine on a scale not seen for generations. The cold was merely the messenger. Hunger was the disaster waiting behind it. The strange cold of 1816 did not strike all at once. It crept in quietly, like a thief learning the patterns of a household before making a move. It softened the soil first, stealing warmth from the ground until seedbeds grew sluggish. Then it leached heat from the air, stunting the growth of early crops. But when the cold began to pair itself with rain, hail, and sudden frosts, the world realized something darker was unfolding. Hunger was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was already on its way, traveling silently, patiently, and without mercy. Across Europe, families gathered at their windows each morning, hoping for a glimpse of sunlight strong enough to warm the fields. Instead, they woke to see frost clinging to rooftops, or rain hammering against soil already saturated to the point of uselessness. Each destroyed planting weakened a community that depended on predictable seasons. People spoke of the failing crops with forced optimism at first, insisting that a warmer stretch of days would arrive soon, that the weather would return to normal, that nature would eventually correct its course. But the weeks churned forward without relief. By midsummer, the damage was undeniable. Wheat stalks were thin, brittle, and stunted. Barley heads failed to form. Potatoes, upon which millions depended, rotted in the ground before they could be harvested. Fields that should have shimmered with green waves of grain instead lay patchy and discolored, their growth arrested by cold nights and cloud-blotted skies. Farmers walked the land with heavy steps, their boots sinking into mud where dry soil should have been. Livestock wandered restlessly, unable to graze on pastures ruined by the constant cycle of freeze and thaw. Fear settled into the villages slowly, then suddenly deepened. Families measured their remaining stores with a precision born of desperation. Cellars once stocked with roots and grains were nearly empty. Some households had already exhausted the last of the previous year's harvest. Bread, once a daily staple, became thinner each week. Bakers mixed sawdust into dough, stretching flour further than it was meant to go. Even then, loaves sold out quickly, purchased by those who could still afford such luxuries. For many, the smell of warm bread became a memory rather than a promise. The hunger spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. First, it affected the poor, laborers, tenant farmers, families who lived harvest to harvest. They stretched thin meals even thinner, hoping to outlast the cold spell. But the cold did not end. Prices rose, markets emptied. Suddenly, hunger was not just the burden of the disadvantaged. It pressed upon merchants, landowners, and entire communities. Grain reserves held by the wealthy dwindled as they attempted to feed villages under their watch. Charitable efforts strained under the weight of mounting need. As the year progressed, famine took a more recognizable shape. It no longer appeared as a series of bad harvests or thinning food supplies. It manifested instead in bodies. Children grew pale and gaunt, their ribs pressed against their skin. Their energy faded until play was impossible. Adults lost weight rapidly, faces hollowing into sharp lines. The sick grew sicker. Minor illnesses, once easily overcome, turned deadly in weakened bodies. The elderly, already fragile, succumbed quickly. Funerals became more frequent, their solemn processions progressing through towns with grim familiarity. In some regions,
Livestock became the first casualties. Farmers slaughtered animals prematurely, needing immediate nourishment more than long-term sustainability. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens filled the early months of hunger with fleeting hope. But once these creatures were consumed, the situation worsened. There were no animals left to breed, no future supply to rely on. Families soon found themselves staring at empty stalls and grazing fields devoid of life. Those who lived near forests or mountain ranges foraged for edible roots, nuts, and berries. But nature itself was distorted. Plants failed to ripen, fruits were smaller, wild populations had been devastated by the unseasonal cold. Instead of bustling undergrowth and buzzing insects, the woods felt strangely quiet. The air held a heavy stillness, interrupted only by the sound of desperate footsteps searching for something to eat. Rivers, too, betrayed the people. Heavy rains muddied the waters, and melting frost altered spawning cycles. Fish became harder to find. Nets came up empty. Streams once full of life now carried the faint smell of decay. Hunger crept into every corner of the ecosystem, and nature offered little to those seeking refuge in its depths.
As food vanished, crowds gathered in town squares, shouting at government officials, demanding aid that did not exist. Authorities tried to maintain order, but their attempts were thin, limited by depleted resources and confusion. In some areas, granaries were raided. Warehouses were broken into under the cover of darkness. People took what they could and fled into the night. Lawlessness surged. Communities that had once relied on cooperation fractured under the pressure of survival. In more isolated regions, hunger took on a different texture. Quiet, slow, and suffocating. Families sat together in dimly lit rooms, sharing meager meals that barely touched their stomachs. They made soups from weeds or boiled leather scraps for sustenance. Some roasted dried bones to extract a hint of fat. Even these desperate measures could not hold back the mounting starvation. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. Parents feared for their children. Farmers felt humiliated by the failure of fields that had fed generations. Clergy struggled to console congregations that questioned why the heavens had turned against them. Rumors circulated that the sun was fading, that an invisible hand was dimming its warmth. Others blamed ancient sins or celestial imbalances. The most fearful claimed they were witnessing the end of days. Yet even in these dark months, no one understood the true cause. Not the common people, not the leaders, not the intellectuals. They did not know that the hunger consuming their land had been born on a distant island, in a volcanic eruption that had thrown the sky into chaos. They did not realize that the thin sunlight, the cold winds, the strange frosts, and the ruined crops were all part of a global chain reaction set in motion by a mountain they had never seen. As autumn approached, the situation grew even worse. The harvest that should have saved them was nearly non-existent. Wheat and barley crops were a fraction of normal yield. Potatoes, a lifeline for many regions, were diseased or stunted. What little survived was fought over, hoarded, or sold at prices that only the wealthy could afford. Winter loomed as an unspoken terror, threatening to finish what the broken summer had started. By October, the hunger had transformed into a grinding daily reality. People's bodies grew weaker, their minds fogged with exhaustion. The once lively chatter of marketplaces became whispers of despair. Hunger gnawed at bone and spirit alike. It was no longer a visitor. It had become the ruler of the land. Every night,
Mothers tucked their hungry children into bed with whispered reassurances they barely believed. Every morning, families rose without knowing if they would have a meal that day. Every week, the situation worsened. There was no relief, no miracle harvest, no break in the relentless cold. The famine had arrived like a plague, but unlike disease, it offered no fever to break, no recovery to hope for. It settled into the world with a heavy permanence, reshaping daily life in ways that would leave scars long after the skies cleared. It was unforgiving, impartial, and endlessly patient. And as winter drew near, long before the next planting season could even be imagined, entire villages understood that they were not merely enduring a bad year, they were surviving the collapse of nature's oldest promise, that summer would bring abundance and that the earth would provide. That promise had been shattered, and in its place stood the reality of a world struggling to feed itself under a sky that no longer behaved as it should. The famine that began with frost and dim skies did not remain confined to individual towns or regions. As 1816 dragged onward, hunger spread beyond borders, crossing mountains, valleys, and rivers with the determination of a living thing. Entire communities found themselves standing at a threshold they had never imagined approaching: the decision to abandon their homes. For centuries, people had built their lives around familiar soil, ancestral lands, and tight-knit villages. But the earth beneath them had turned hostile. Food no longer grew there. Livestock no longer survived. Hope no longer rested in the fields that once defined their lives. And so, with heavy hearts and weakened bodies, the world began to move. The migrations started quietly. A few families in each village packed what little remained of their possessions, loaded their last healthy animals, and set out along old trade routes in search of something, anything, better. They walked with slow, deliberate steps, carrying children who no longer had the strength to walk on their own. They moved not because they wanted new lives, but because staying meant waiting for hunger to finish what the cold had begun. At first, their departure was seen as a sad tragedy. By summer's end, it had become a pattern. Soon the roads leading out of towns and cities were lined with travelers. They were not adventurers seeking fortune, nor settlers following dreams of new frontiers. They were refugees of nature. The term had not yet been coined, but their reality embodied it. Uprooted, desperate, searching for survival in a world that had forgotten how to feed them. Footpaths that once echoed with the rhythmic pace of trade caravans now carried the shuffling gait of exhausted families. Their footsteps blended with the wind, creating a quiet, endless sound across the countryside.
The movement of people stretched across continents. In Switzerland, entire villages emptied as families abandoned their alpine homes, worn down by months of starvation and repeated crop failures. They climbed through mountain passes, navigating icy paths even in summer, hoping that the next valley might offer warmth or food. But the next valley, too, lay under the same strange cold and the same ruined fields. Many kept walking anyway, because turning back meant surrender. In France and Germany, the migration took on a river-like quality. Streams of people flowed toward cities rumored to have grain reserves or relief efforts. Yet cities were no safer than villages. The urban poor, already vulnerable, were now joined by desperate rural families seeking food that did not exist. Crowded streets overflowed with hungry bodies, inns filled beyond capacity. Barns and warehouses became temporary shelters, though their walls offered little comfort against starvation. Soup kitchens appeared spontaneously, efforts organized by churches, wealthy families, or groups of neighbors pooling their meager resources, but they quickly became overwhelmed.
A pot that was meant to feed 20 people ended up feeding 100. A loaf of bread meant for a single family was split among dozens. It was never enough. Panic crept into communities like a slow fog. As more people fled the countryside and flocked to cities, the fragile supply chains of the era broke under the strain. Grain shipments that might have fed a town were intercepted by starving crowds before reaching their destination. In some regions, armed escorts accompanied wagons to prevent riots. Even then, thieves lurked along roadsides, driven not by greed, but by the simple need to survive another day. Diseases spread wherever hunger traveled. Weakened bodies were fertile ground for illness. Dysentery, typhus, and fevers of unknown origin followed the movements of refugees like silent companions. Camps formed along the fringes of towns, makeshift clusters of tents, carts, and lean-to shelters where families huddled together against the cold. These camps grew into grim settlements where hunger, cold, and disease intertwined. The smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and damp earth clung to the air. Children cried through the night, their voices thin and brittle. Many fell ill, and too many did not recover. As the crisis deepened, the migrations expanded across oceans. In North America, the failures of the season drove families westward in search of lands with more dependable climates. Settlers, pushed by desperation rather than ambition, packed wagons with what little food they had left and headed toward frontier territories. The forests and open plains of the West promised fertile soil untouched by years of cultivation. But even the West had not entirely escaped the strange chill. Frost struck unexpectedly, and crops struggled even in healthier soils. Yet the belief in new land, in a fresh start, was enough to keep the movement alive.
Among the cities, towns, and scattered rural communities, social structures began to fracture under the weight of mass migration. Traditional roles dissolved as people of all classes found themselves equally vulnerable. Landowners could not rely on tenant farmers who had abandoned the fields. Merchants could not sell goods to customers with no means to purchase them. Clergy faced congregations too numerous and too desperate for comfort alone. Even governments, already strained by the aftermath of wars and economic instability, found themselves powerless in the face of a crisis not born from politics, but from the planet itself. Tensions mounted wherever large groups of refugees gathered. Local residents, struggling with their own food shortages, feared the arrival of new mouths to feed. They viewed travelers with suspicion, sometimes hostility. Accusations spread. Strangers brought disease, strangers carried theft, strangers consumed what little remained. These fears often erupted into conflict, pushing refugees further down roads they had no choice but to follow. Yet, among the movement and the misery, there were also moments of profound humanity. Some communities shared what little they had, opening their doors to strangers and offering shelter in barns, sheds, or basements. Neighbors gathered to divide dwindling supplies with fairness. Members of religious groups walked miles to bring aid to isolated families. Charity took on new forms as people learned that survival required cooperation, not isolation. The efforts were often small, but they represented a stubborn refusal to surrender completely to despair. In some areas, entire districts were transformed into channels of migration, with continuous flows of weary families moving through. The roads became living timelines of the disaster. New faces appeared daily, some hopeful, some despairing, some barely conscious. Wheels creaked, boots cracked, and the repetitive thud of footsteps marked the passing days. Tattered clothing fluttered in cold winds. Voices rose and fell in murmurs of exhaustion. As each group moved on, another followed, creating an endless procession of humanity pressed forward by necessity. No one knew where safety lay. Some turned toward rumors of better harvests in neighboring countries. Others clung to stories of distant lands where the weather had not yet turned cruel. Most were unsure whether such places even existed, but uncertainty was preferable to staying behind and waiting for starvation.
As autumn pushed deeper into the year, the migrations intensified. People no longer hoped for a miraculous harvest. They knew none was coming. Families banded together, joining others on the road, forming temporary traveling communities fueled by solidarity and desperation. Their destinations varied, but their purpose was the same: to escape the hunger pinning them in place. The world had become a patchwork of moving populations, and the roads were arteries carrying the lifeblood of societies trying to survive the impossible. The migrations were not simply journeys. They were reshaping nations, altering demographics, and setting in motion long-term changes that would continue far beyond the end of the crisis. The earth itself had become unpredictable. Its seasons no longer obeyed the ancient rhythms. Its warmth no longer returned on schedule. For humanity, this instability translated into a single, unavoidable truth. The world as they had known it was failing them. To remain in place was to die slowly. To move was to gamble with survival. Across continents, the sight of long lines of refugees became commonplace. The world had entered a time when home was no longer a location, but a memory, something carried in the mind rather than held in the hands. The famine had devoured certainty, and in its place it left a mass exodus that would reshape lives across the globe. And as winter approached, promising deeper cold, harsher storms, and even greater scarcity, the world braced for the next chapter of suffering. Hunger had driven people to move, but the coming months would determine who survived the journey and who would be lost along the way. Europe entered the late months of 1816 with a kind of collective weariness that felt older than any single generation. The skies had stayed dim for so long that people began to forget what normal daylight looked like. The air carried a chill that clung to skin even in the height of summer. And everywhere, across villages, cities, valleys, and mountain towns, hunger carved its way through the population with mechanical persistence. It was during these months that Europe acquired a grim new name for the era: the Year of Beggars. The transformation happened slowly, then all at once. In the beginning, beggars were individuals, wandering laborers out of work, widows left without grain, elderly villagers unable to fend for themselves. But as each harvest failed, as fields lay barren and livestock died, the number of those in need grew exponentially. Begging ceased to be a condition of misfortune and became a state of existence for thousands. It was no longer defined by shame or moral judgment. It became a symbol of survival. Entire families took to the roads, carrying whatever remained of their possessions, offering labor, cloth, tools, or simply hands stretched out for mercy. In Switzerland, a nation already constrained by rugged mountains and short growing seasons, the famine struck with exceptional force. The brutal cold had destroyed crops repeatedly, and the soaring price of imported grain made food unattainable for all but the wealthy. Villagers descended into cities, gathering in public squares, markets, and church courtyards. Many carried small bundles of their last belongings, patches of clothing, simple tools, a child's blanket, objects representing the final remnants of stability. They offered these in exchange for crusts of bread or bowls of weak broth. The roads between the villages and cities became moving chains of desperate travelers. Some walked barefoot, their shoes long since worn through. Others wrapped rags around their feet to protect their skin from the cold stones. Children clung to their parents, silent, not because they fully understood the situation, but because hunger had drained their strength. Each morning, a new line of beggars gathered outside inns, bakeries, and government buildings. They waited, sat, shivered, and hoped for anything that might help them through the day. In France, the scenes were even more dramatic. Years of political upheaval had already strained the nation, and now the weather delivered its own cruelty. The countryside emptied as people searched for relief in cities like Paris, Lyon, and Strasbourg. City streets filled with figures wrapped in threadbare clothing, their faces hollow and exhausted. Mothers carried infants that barely stirred. Groups huddled beneath bridges or alleyways, seeking shelter from the relentless rain and unexpected frosts. The smell of dampness and starvation lingered everywhere. Meanwhile, German territories, still fragmented into numerous small states, struggled to organize coordinated relief. Grain merchants raised prices in response to scarcity, sparking riots and outbursts of violence. Crowds stormed market stalls. Grain warehouses became targets of desperate looters. Town guards attempted to maintain order, but hunger often overwhelmed fear. The authorities arrested beggars for crowding city centers, but releasing them simply sent them back onto the streets. There was no punishment for hunger, no legal remedy for starvation. Churches attempted to intervene. Some distributed thin soups to long lines of people that stretched past the doors and around the buildings. Others opened their halls at night to shelter the weakest. But even religious institutions had limited resources. Their cellars emptied quickly. Their funds evaporated. Clergy members wrote letters to political officials pleading for assistance, but governments themselves were crippled by the widespread crisis. Local leaders spoke in somber tones of a calamity beyond human influence. Travelers passing through Europe wrote of towns filled with wandering groups who begged at every road, bridge, and field. The sight became so common that even long-distance merchants, hardened by years of travel, were shaken. They described landscapes marked by silence, fields without workers, roads without trade wagons, and villages where only children and the elderly remained, the rest having left in search of food elsewhere. Markets changed their appearance as well. Where stalls once overflowed with seasonal produce, carrots, greens, apples, pears, and grains, there were now only small piles of wilted vegetables, overpriced grain sacks, and meat so scarce that many families had not tasted it in months. The abundance that characterized summers in Europe had vanished, replaced by scarcity so severe that markets became quiet places, emptied of the usual clamor.
One of the most visible consequences of the famine was the transformation of Europe's social climate. Suspicion grew between neighbors, people guarded their grain with vigilance, barns were secured as though holding treasure. A man carrying a loaf of bread through a village might attract a crowd of hollow-eyed onlookers. Theft increased, not motivated by greed but survivorship. Villagers caught stealing apples or potatoes faced harsh punishment. Yet punishment did little to deter others, for necessity overshadowed fear. Governments attempted to impose price controls on grain, but these measures often backfired. Farmers who managed to grow small quantities of crops refused to sell them at artificially low prices, choosing instead to hoard their yield or trade secretly for higher returns. Markets shrank further. Black markets emerged. The very structure of food distribution began to crumble. The psychological toll of the famine was immense. Europe had suffered through wars, plagues, and economic crises, but hunger carried a unique type of despair. It was a quiet agony that stretched across months, dulling the senses and clouding the mind. People grew withdrawn. The cold darkness of the year diminished not just the fields, but the human spirit. Songs were less frequent, celebrations disappeared, even church bells seemed quieter, as though muffled by the same haze that dimmed the sun. Children, normally the heartbeat of a community, became haunting reminders of the crisis. Their growth stunted, their faces matured unnaturally by suffering. In some regions, orphan numbers climbed as parents succumbed to starvation or illness. These children wandered through towns in small groups, bound together by necessity.
They slept under overhangs and in abandoned barns, surviving on scraps and charity. Their presence became a symbol of the era, innocence caught in the cruel machinery of nature gone awry. Travel between regions took on a surreal quality. Roads that once thrived with farmers and traders now held only thin trails of hungry travelers moving in a single direction, away from failure. Inns along these roads were unable to house them all. Barns, attics, and stables became temporary shelters. Villages that once prided themselves on hospitality were forced to turn away newcomers simply because there was no food left to give. Yet despite the overwhelming suffering, some parts of Europe tried to respond with resilience. Communities set up grain-sharing programs, local leaders organized relief kitchens, wealthier landowners donated parts of their harvests to the starving. These gestures did not stop the famine, but they provided brief pockets of relief, moments where human kindness broke through the misery. Art and literature of the era would later reflect the despair of these months. Paintings captured the dim skies, the gaunt faces, the hollow landscapes. Written accounts describe the eeriness of a year in which weather acted like an unpredictable tyrant, inflicting storms one day and frosts the next. The memory of the Year of Beggars would remain etched in European consciousness long after the skies cleared. By late autumn, desperation reached its peak. Winter approached with a promise of even greater suffering. The refugee camps around cities grew larger. The countryside emptied further. Stories circulated of remote villages where entire populations had vanished, leaving behind silent homes and abandoned fields. Whether they perished or migrated, no one knew. Europe had become a continent in motion, restless, hungry, and uncertain. The famine had pushed humanity into a state of raw survival, and though people did not yet know it, the worst of the strange year had not yet passed. For as the cold deepened and the days shortened, another part of the world, thousands of miles away, was descending into its own crisis. The shadow cast by Tambora had not spared the New World. Across the Atlantic, the Americas were beginning to feel the same cold breath of climate chaos. Across the Atlantic, the same dimming sky that had cast Europe into hunger slowly stretched its reach toward the young and growing settlements of the Americas. North America in particular had always known the bite of winter and the unpredictability of frontier weather, but nothing in the collective memory of farmers, pioneers, or native nations resembled what happened in 1816. It began subtly, with small fluctuations in spring temperatures, but soon transformed into a season so warped and relentless that it disrupted every rhythm of life. The year without a summer had arrived, and the continent found itself caught beneath a sun that no longer warmed the land. The earliest signs appeared in New England. Spring broke later than usual, arriving with sullen reluctance. April brought a few days of warmth, enough for farmers to prepare their fields and plan their year's work. But then came sudden chills, denting the optimism of planting season. Seeds placed in the soil hesitated, as though unsure of the conditions around them. A strange stillness enveloped the land. The air felt heavy and muted, lacking the lively song of insects that normally returned with the thaw. Trees budded late, their leaves slower to unfurl, as if nature itself sensed that something was amiss. Then came the cold snap of early June. On the morning of June 6th, residents awoke to see frost coating the ground and ice forming on the surfaces of ponds. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Their instinct warned them of a chill too deep for the season. Cows stood stiff-legged in the fields, breaths blooming white in the air. Farmers stared in disbelief at their ruined seedlings, which lay wilted and blackened from the unexpected freeze. Crops that had been planted with fragile hope were wiped out in a single night. What followed was even stranger. The frost did not leave. Days that should have been warm instead held a persistent chill, and nights dipped into temperatures suited for winter. Snow fell in parts of New England, drifting lightly across the soil in patterns that defied reason. Newspapers recorded the event with stunned fascination, describing flakes that floated down in June, leaving white blankets where green fields should have stood. People marveled at the bizarre sight, unaware that the surreal snowfall was only the beginning of the misery to come. When the weather warmed briefly, farmers scrambled to replant. They scattered seeds with trembling hands, desperate for a second chance. But the warmth was fleeting. Another frost came in July, freezing corn shoots before they could stretch upward. Beans died in their rows. Potatoes rotted in the chilled ground. The cycle repeated throughout the summer. Brief moments of mild weather, followed by cold that snapped across the land like a whip. Each frost was a blow to communities that depended on their harvests, not just for income, but for survival. The confusion extended far beyond the crops. Animals behaved oddly, sensing the disorder before humans could fully grasp it. Birds delayed migration patterns. Some flew south prematurely. Others arrived late. Bees struggled to find flowering plants, disrupting pollination. Wild game grew harder to find, driven away by shifting weather patterns. Even the rivers behaved strangely, alternately swelling from unexpected rains and shrinking during unseasonal freezes. The economic consequences hit swiftly. Grain prices climbed with alarming speed, particularly in the northeastern states. Families who had lived comfortably found themselves calculating every meal, stretching ingredients to the edge of their limits. Bread shrank in size. Soups thinned into pale broths. Desperation crept into markets, creating tension between buyers and sellers. Some merchants hoarded supplies to sell at inflated prices, worsening the suffering of the poor.
In rural towns, hunger began quietly. Families skipped meals to feed their children. They gathered wild plants, though these too grew in scarcity. Fishing communities fared slightly better, catching what they could. But even the bounty of the sea seemed muted that year. Cold air disrupted spawning cycles. Storms struck without warning, tossing fishing boats in violent waves. No part of the food chain was spared. Farther inland, across the frontier territories, the impact was just as severe. Settlers depended on seasonal harvests to sustain homesteads. When the crops failed, there were no markets or established trade networks to rely on. Frontier families often lived weeks from the nearest town, and isolation magnified their suffering. Many were forced to slaughter livestock early, knowing they lacked the feed to sustain them through a winter that showed every sign of being longer and harsher than usual. Some packed up and headed west, not in hope of riches, but in search of land less affected by the cold. The westward migration, already underway before the strange year, accelerated dramatically. Entire wagon trains formed from families fleeing failed farms. The promise of fertile land beyond the Appalachian Mountains became a lifeline. Even though there was no guarantee conditions would be better there. Still, movement felt like the only option. Towns emptied as families joined the continuous line of travelers trudging towards uncertainty. Roads that once echoed with the optimism of new settlers now carried the heavy footsteps of climate refugees. Cities along the eastern seaboard were overwhelmed by the influx of the hungry. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia saw unprecedented numbers of rural families arriving in search of work or food. Shelters overflowed. Churches distributed soup to long lines of people who waited patiently despite their weakening bodies. Urban poor, who had long struggled with hunger, were now joined by a wave of displaced farmers. Factories and workshops absorbed some of the workforce, but the demand far exceeded the opportunities. In Canada, conditions mirrored those in New England.
Frost swept across Quebec and Ontario, killing crops repeatedly. Communities accustomed to harsh winters could not compensate for summer cold. With harvests ruined, the fur trade and fishing industries carried new burdens. Indigenous communities, who had deep knowledge of seasonal cycles, found those patterns disrupted. Hunting grounds yielded less than expected. Plant-based foods that normally flourished in summer were scarce. Cultural practices tied to seasonal changes were thrown into confusion.
South of the United States, in regions closer to the tropics, the effects were different but no less severe. The Caribbean experienced unusual weather patterns, including storms and heavy rainfall that disrupted agriculture. Sugar production suffered, damaging the economic stability of islands dependent on plantation systems. Meanwhile, parts of Central and South America saw disruptions in rainfall cycles affecting key crops like maize. Some areas faced drought, while others drowned under days of torrential rain. The psychological impact of the strange year weighed heavily across the Americas. Communities accustomed to enduring hardship now faced something that felt supernatural in scale. Observers looked upward, questioning why the sun had lost its warmth. Farmers, normally grounded in the practicalities of weather and soil, began speaking in hushed tones of omens and curses. Preachers delivered sermons with grave seriousness, interpreting the climate anomaly as a warning or punishment. The world felt unsteady, as though some unseen force had tilted the balance of nature. Autumn brought no relief. The harvest, what little survived, was meager. Families stored whatever they could, knowing the winter ahead would be brutal. Prices in markets surged again, reaching levels that forced even the comfortable into difficult decisions. Poorer families relied on charity or community support networks, though these too struggled under the growing demand. Hunger, once a slow current, now surged like a rising tide. Yet amidst the suffering, the people of the Americas demonstrated resilience. They shared what they could. Communities organized mutual aid. Strangers helped strangers on the roads, offering firewood, blankets, or a bit of cornbread from their dwindling stock. When weather defied understanding, humanity responded with cooperation, born from necessity. Still, survival came at a cost. By the time winter approached, the fear that settled over the land was palpable. The strange summer had revealed how fragile their existence truly was, how deeply they depended on the balance of nature that now seemed broken. And as the cold deepened, travelers from distant lands brought rumors of a disaster just as severe, but far more slowly unfolding across the world's largest continent. Asia, carrying millions of lives upon its vast expanse, was facing disruptions even more complex and tragic. Asia, vast and diverse, carried within its borders nearly half the world's population in 1816. From the Himalayan kingdoms to the crowded river plains of India and China, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the drought-prone plateaus of Persia, the land held countless cultures, languages, and histories. Yet no region, no matter how remote or how ancient, could escape the strange imbalance gripping the world. While Europe starved publicly and the Americas shivered under summer frosts, Asia endured a quieter but far deadlier tragedy, one that unfolded not with spectacle, but with relentless, choking inevitability. The first hints of disaster were subtle. Farmers in the Ganges River basin noticed that the monsoon's arrival, normally predictable to the weak, came late. The early clouds gathered on the horizon with hesitation, drifting listlessly without releasing their torrents. The soil dried faster than usual under a hazy sky that seemed simultaneously humid and dim. Villagers who had relied on centuries of agricultural tradition grew uneasy. The monsoon was more than a weather pattern. It was a lifeline. Its absence, even for a short while,
could mean disaster. Weeks passed, then months, and still the monsoon failed to arrive with its expected force. The rains, when they came, fell weakly or in scattered bursts, insufficient to nourish the rice paddies that covered much of the region. Cracks formed in the ground. Irrigation canals shrank to muddy threads. The heat grew oppressive, pressing down on villages like a suffocating blanket, though even this heat felt uncanny, less the natural warmth of summer and more a sticky stagnation without true sunlight. In the plains of Bengal, rice shoots, normally bright and tall, struggled to surface. The stalks were pale, thin, and brittle. Buffaloes, essential for plowing, sank into drying mud pits where they once moved freely. Farmers dug deeper into wells that had supplied generations, but each bucket returned lighter than the last. Families gathered in the evenings to watch the horizon, praying for clouds thick enough to darken the sky and release the rains that fed millions. But the clouds drifted away, leaving the land thirsty. The failure of the monsoon set off a chain reaction that reached deep into society. The price of rice began to rise, slowly at first, then sharply. Grain traders, aware of the impending scarcity, hoarded what they could. Markets buzzed with rumors of shortages. Families who lived day to day found themselves unable to afford even a single bowl of grain. People rationed tiny portions, stretching meals into thin, watery stews that offered little nourishment. Parents watched children weaken, their limbs growing slender, their eyes losing their once lively focus. Further east, in the great river valleys of China, the situation unfolded differently, but with equally devastating consequences. While parts of India suffered from drought, China's weather veered toward instability. Some regions endured sudden floods triggered by erratic cloud bursts. Rains fell without warning, overwhelming riverbanks and drowning fields. Villages along the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers saw water rise too swiftly to prepare. Homes were swept away, and the fertile soil that sustained their crops washed downstream in thick brown currents. Other regions, however, faced the opposite fate. No rains came. The ground hardened beneath a dim sky, corn and wheat fields wilted early, and farmers, bewildered by the contradictions, could not predict whether the season would drown them or starve them. Traditional farming almanacs, once revered for guiding planting decisions, became useless in a year when nature abandoned its patterns. The instability of the weather set the stage for another catastrophe, one not born from crops or climate alone. In Bengal, where drought weakened bodies and contaminated water sources, a new illness emerged from the stagnating rivers and tainted wells. It spread quietly at first, carried by polluted water and unwashed hands. Then it surged. Cholera, still poorly understood at the time, began its deadly march across villages already suffering from hunger. The disease took advantage of weakened immune systems. Dehydration struck swiftly. Entire families fell ill within days. Villages lost dozens of people in a single week. Funeral pyres burned continuously along the riverbanks, their smoke rising into the already dimmed sky. Those who survived often fled, attempting to escape the sickness, but in doing so, they carried the infection into neighboring regions. The migration born from famine now fused with the migration born from disease, spreading both across the land. In China, similar outbreaks took root. Waterborne illnesses flourished in the crowded refugee camps that formed around flooded regions. Doctors, limited by traditional methods and lacking modern medical knowledge, could only offer herbs and prayers. The sick lay on bamboo mats, trembling under thin cloths, while families watched helplessly. The suffering was quiet, private, hidden within homes and temples. Asia's calamity was not marked by public riots or dramatic collapses, but by this silent, grinding attrition. Even the vast forests and remote mountains of Southeast Asia could not escape the strange year. In Java and Sumatra, closer to Tambora itself, the ashfall had dimmed the sky long before the global effects appeared. Crops withered under the withering sunlight, water sources turned cloudy, farmers abandoned ruined fields and migrated toward coastal cities, hoping for work or aid. But the cities, overwhelmed by arrivals, could only offer overcrowded shelters and meager rations. Hunger took many, disease took more.
Further along the trade routes, in Persia and Central Asia, the climate anomaly created its own brand of catastrophe. Regions accustomed to arid summers experienced extended droughts, pastures shrank, herds of goats and sheep died in staggering numbers. Nomadic tribes, reliant on animal husbandry for their livelihoods, faced the collapse of their entire economy. The death of livestock meant the loss of food, wealth, and cultural identity. Migration became a necessity, but even the migration routes offered no relief. Wells dried up, grasslands turned to dust. Caravans crossed barren expanses, hoping to reach towns rumored to have water or grain, only to find those towns equally devastated. Millions across Asia suffered in silence. Unlike Europe, whose crisis captured widespread documentation, Asia's tragedy was less visible to the outside world. Reports flowed slowly, often carried by traders or missionaries, describing villages emptied by famine, fields lying barren under strange skies, and entire districts crippled by disease. But the true magnitude remained obscured by distance, linguistic barriers, and the slower pace of global communication. Yet those who lived through the year understood its scale. They felt it in their bones, saw it in the faces of their families, and heard it in the hushed conversations around market stalls that carried almost nothing for sale. They experienced it in the empty warehouses, the dry riverbeds, the silent paddies, the abandoned homes. For many, the year without a summer was not defined by cold, as it was in Europe or North America, but by disruption, the shattering of cycles that had governed life for centuries. The psychological toll ran deep. Farmers, whose knowledge of seasons passed through generations, found themselves adrift in uncertainty. Entire belief systems tied to nature's rhythms trembled under the pressure of inexplicable change. Letters and diaries described the eerie quality of the air, the dimmed sunrise that cast no warmth, the strange quiet that hung over fields. Some said the sky looked sick, as though it carried a hidden fever. Others claimed the sun had been swallowed by a dragon, a metaphor born from fear rather than myth. As 1816 drew towards its end, Asia was wounded, but still enduring. The suffering had been immense, yet the continent's long history of resilience carried its people forward. Still, the cost was unimaginable. The famine had killed many, the most deaths went unrecorded, and the cholera epidemic would continue for years, creating a legacy of suffering that extended beyond the dimmed skies.
The world had changed. The seasons had betrayed their centuries-long promise. And though Asia endured in silence, its tragedy was no less severe. The continent's vast geography had not shielded it. Instead, it had allowed the catastrophe to spread across unimaginable distances, touching kingdoms, villages, empires, and tribes alike. And in the midst of this global misery, something strange was brewing far from the starving fields and flooded valleys. In the darkened corners of Europe, where young artists and thinkers gathered to escape the gloom, the dim light and eerie skies began inspiring ideas that would outlast the suffering. The darkness would soon give birth to stories, visions, and art unlike anything the world had known. As the world endured the bitter cold, darkened skies, and unrelenting hunger of 1816, a quieter transformation unfolded that no one could have predicted. The same dim atmosphere that cast fear across continents also gave rise to an unexpected surge of human imagination. It was as if the diminished sunlight, the eerie twilight glow, and the haunting stillness awoke something hidden within the human spirit, a raw, restless creativity shaped by despair, uncertainty, and contemplation. From the dismal year that devoured crops and lives, a different kind of harvest emerged, one of ideas, stories, art, and innovation. Nowhere was this transformation more vivid than in Europe's cultural centers. The dimmed skies, tinged with strange hues of red and orange, created an ambiance that felt otherworldly. Sunsets lasted longer, bleeding across the horizon like surreal paintings. Mornings broke slowly, reluctantly, with light too weak to chase away the shadows. Cities and villages alike lived in a kind of perpetual dusk. For most, this was a curse, a reminder of the cold that gnawed at the bones and the hunger that stalked every household. But for artists, poets, and philosophers, the altered world offered new visions, new fears, and new fascinations. In Switzerland, where the gloomy summer was especially brutal, groups of travelers, writers, and thinkers gathered to escape the chill in lakeside villas. They arrived expecting to enjoy the serene landscapes, the mountains, and the fresh air. Instead, they found themselves trapped indoors by relentless storms, freezing nights, and skies too dark for daytime walks. The bad weather forced people together, creating long stretches of time filled with conversation, introspection, and creative tension. It was in this unusual climate that some of the most influential ideas of the era were born. In one such gathering, a circle of young writers sat in a villa overlooking Lake Geneva, surrounded by windows that framed a sky unlike any they had known. Days passed under a canopy of swirling clouds. Lightning cracked across the mountains with unusual frequency, illuminating the water in ghastly flashes. The storms felt unending, their thunder echoing through the villa's halls. In that confinement, where choices were limited to reading, writing, or discussing the strange weather, the seeds of Gothic imagination flourished.
As the storm-swept nights dragged on, these writers entertained each other with tales of ghosts, science, and the fear that the world might be changing in ways too vast to comprehend. The nature of life itself became a subject of fascination. What was the boundary between life and death? Could it be crossed? What forces governed existence? In the eerie half-light of that unnatural summer, questions like these gained a frightening weight. From this atmosphere emerged a story that would shape the future of literature. The tale took root in the mind of a young woman. Inspired by the unnatural climate, the thunder that rolled across the lake, and the sense that nature itself was unraveling. She envisioned a world where humans tampered with the forces of life, creating something that should never have existed. The creature she imagined would become one of literature's most enduring symbols of fear, loneliness, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The novel she began under that sunless sky would later be known to the world as Frankenstein. Its creation was inseparable from the conditions of 1816. The bleak beauty of the dimmed summer, the strange storms, and the sense of lurking catastrophe shaped every layer of the narrative. In many ways, the creature was born from the same darkness that had claimed the summer, a product of the confusion and dread that lingered in the world. Artists, too, found their vision reshaped by the year's strange light. In England, painters gazed at sunsets that glowed more intensely than memory suggested. The volcanic particles suspended in the sky created colors that defied ordinary palettes. Deep crimsons, haunting purples, luminous oranges. These sunsets lingered on the horizon for unusually long stretches, creating dramatic scenes that seemed to merge the natural world with dreamlike distortions. Painters took their canvases outdoors, struggling to capture the new mood of the atmosphere. The shifting tones found their way into sketches and oil paintings, altering artistic movements for decades.
One prominent landscape painter, known for his sensitivity to light and emotion, was particularly affected. He watched as each sunset, distorted by the volcanic ash, transformed the sky into a burning canvas. The sight unsettled him, but also inspired him. He painted what he saw: fiery skies, dim horizons, blurred outlines of trees and rivers, and these works would later be recognized as part of the evolution toward a more expressive, emotional style. Though he did not know the cause, his art absorbed the spirit of the year without a summer, reflecting the tension between beauty and dread that defined the era. Writers across Europe penned poems and essays describing the eerie changes in nature. Some observed the contrast between vibrant sunsets in cold air, describing them with a sense of awe and unease. Others wrote political or philosophical reflections, linking the climate anomaly to society's fragility. Many felt that nature, once a source of stability, had revealed its capacity for chaos. Their writings echoed this revelation, blending fear with fascination.
Scientists, too, were drawn into the strange mood of discovery. Before the year without a summer, few had considered that a volcanic eruption could influence global weather. But the bizarre events sparked new curiosity. Observers began documenting atmospheric haze, temperature records, crop failures, and unusual storms. Scholars compared notes from different regions, noticing patterns that transcended geography. Though the full scientific explanation would take decades to form, the year planted the seeds of new disciplines: meteorology, climate science, and the study of global atmospheric systems. In the universities of Europe, professors lectured on ancient eruptions and speculated whether the sun's energy fluctuated over time. Astronomers tracked the dimming light, noting how it altered visibility and changed the color of the sky. Natural philosophers debated theories about electrical forces, celestial events, and disruptions in the ether. Even if their theories were incomplete, the intellectual excitement they sparked was real. Curiosity became a survival mechanism in a world where certainty had vanished. But creativity did not arise only in the intellectual or artistic elite. Ordinary people, trapped inside their homes by cold rain or forced into unfamiliar routines by failed harvests, found themselves turning to introspection, stories, and imagination. Folk tales evolved. New myths emerged about creatures in the mist, spirits riding the storms, or gods expressing anger through the dimming sun. These stories blended fear with creativity, providing communities with a sense of explanation when logic faltered. In some regions, musicians composed haunting melodies inspired by the melancholy atmosphere. Songs carried across fields and through narrow streets, echoing the loneliness of the year. Dancers performed in candle-lit halls, their movements reflecting the slipping boundaries between light and dark. Even craftspeople changed their work, creating objects decorated with motifs of twisted trees, shadowed hills, or distorted sunsets. The year without a summer became a canvas that reshaped imagination worldwide. Even in the midst of suffering, the human mind reached for expression. The darkness did not extinguish creativity, it fueled it. Where crops failed, ideas blossomed. Where hunger gnawed, art soothed. Where nature faltered, invention stepped forward. By the end of 1816, Europe and the Americas had both endured immense hardship. Countless families still faced hunger, and countless fields lay barren.
Yet beneath the devastation, a quiet transformation had taken root. The strange skies and the eerie cold had left an indelible mark on human creativity. They had inspired stories of monsters and men, driven artists to new techniques, and pushed scholars toward questions that would eventually reshape scientific understanding. The suffering was far from over, but humanity had begun to adapt, not only physically, but spiritually and intellectually. The world had been shaken, but from the cracks emerged something unexpected, a fire of creativity that burned brighter than the dimmed sun overhead. As the year drew to a close, the question lingered. Would the sun return to its former strength? Would the seasons heal? Or would the strange climate deepen its grip? The answer would come slowly, carried by the gradual settling of volcanic ash and the slow, patient recovery of the planet. As 1816 faded into 1817, the world held its breath, waiting to see if the turning of the year would bring relief or simply continue the strange, punishing cycle that had consumed the globe. The sun, muted for so many months by the volcanic veil drifting high in the atmosphere, still felt pale and frail as it rose over fields that lay brown and exhausted. People watched it carefully each morning, hoping for the familiar strength of its warmth to return and fearing that it never would. The memory of what sunlight felt like, true sunlight, deep and golden, was beginning to blur, pushed out by the year-long dimness that had seeped into every corner of the world. In some regions, the change came subtly. The frost still appeared in the mornings, but it lingered a little less. The weak light still spread across the horizon, but it held a faint warmth that had been absent the year before. Birds, which had delayed their seasonal habits, began to sing once more, testing the air cautiously. The animals seemed the first to sense the shift, responding instinctively to the small but vital difference in the world's energy. Their movements grew more purposeful. Their calls carried a tone that suggested nature was slowly trying to right itself. Farmers were more hesitant. They had learned through bitter experience not to trust the sky. The wounds of the last year were too fresh, the losses too devastating. They ventured into their fields cautiously, touching the soil as though handling something fragile. When the thaw deepened and the earth softened, they prepared their tools, but their movements were slow, deliberate, haunted by memories of frost-bitten harvests. They planted seeds with a mix of dread and determination, whispering silent pleas to the sky, hoping for mercy.
As winter retreated, the strange haze that had lingered for so long gradually began to dissipate. The volcanic particles, which had drifted around the globe like a ghostly shroud, finally started to settle. Rainstorms washed some of the debris from the air, carrying it down into rivers and fields. Winds dispersed the thinner concentrations. Slowly, the invisible veil thinned, allowing more sunlight to reach the earth. The difference was almost imperceptible at first. A slightly brighter afternoon, a slightly warmer breeze, a day without the familiar gray tint, but these small changes gathered strength as the weeks passed. By spring of 1817, something shifted deeply and unmistakably. The sky regained a softness, a clarity, a sense of depth that it had lost in the abrasive glare of the strange previous year. The blue deepened. Clouds regained their familiar shapes instead of the smeared, blurred forms they had taken under the muted light. Sunsets still burned with vivid volcanic hues, but their intensity began to soften, losing the unsettling glow that had made even beauty feel threatening. The world was exhaling, and the sky showed it. Grass returned to fields that had lain barren. New growth pushed through the soil with cautious persistence. Flowers bloomed again, though not in their usual numbers, and trees unfurled new leaves with a hesitance that echoed the mood of the people. Farmers watched their crops with a vigilance that bordered on fear, scanning the horizon each evening for signs of the cold returning. But day after day, the weather held steady. It seemed almost unnatural. Warmth returning, rains falling when needed, frost avoiding the height of spring. After a year of chaos, stability felt like a fragile miracle. Communities that had fractured during the famine now began the slow work of piecing themselves back together. Towns opened their roads to returning families. Migrations reversed as refugees retraced their steps, hoping to rebuild the homes they had abandoned. Some found only the remnants of shattered lives, collapsed barns, overgrown fields, ruined mills. But even these ruins offered hope. They represented a place to begin again, a patch of earth where seeds could be planted and shelters rebuilt. Europe, battered by the year of Beggars, saw its villages slowly refill. Children who had grown thin from hunger gained color in their cheeks once more. Markets reopened, though their stalls remained sparse for a time. Relief missions that had struggled to keep starvation at bay shifted their efforts toward reconstruction, helping communities re-establish the fragile chains of food, trade, and livelihood.
In the Americas, the return of sunlight brought a sense of renewal that felt almost emotional. Farmers reworked their fields with a determination sharpened by hardship. Frontier settlers who had fled failing homesteads now found new land more forgiving, bathed in a sun that finally carried warmth. The strange storms subsided. The frosts retreated to their proper season. Migrating families who had expected to find a world permanently damaged were instead greeted by signs of recovery. Buds on trees, thawing rivers, and a sky that slowly grew clearer with each passing day. Asia, too, felt the change, though its wounds were deeper and more complex. The monsoons returned with steadier patterns. Floods became less erratic. Drought-stricken regions received rain that seeped into the cracked earth, coaxing life from soil that had forgotten its own fertility. The harvests of 1817 could not erase the famine or the losses, but they showed that the world's cycles were repairing themselves. Even the spread of disease slowed as clean water sources replenished and weakened populations regained the strength needed to resist illness. Yet the return of stability did not erase memory. The year without a summer left scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, that would shape future generations. Children who had lived through the hunger would grow into adults who cherished the sight of full fields and the smell of fresh bread. Parents who had watched their families starve learned to store food more cautiously, to preserve grain against the possibility of nature's betrayal. Governments, shaken by the fragility of their societies, reconsidered how to prepare for the unexpected. Communities everywhere became more aware of how closely life depended on the balance of the elements. Scientists, deeply stirred by the anomaly, began investigating the causes with renewed vigor. They recorded temperature data, compared notes from around the world, and studied reports of volcanic activity. The connection between Tambora's eruption and the global climate collapse became a topic of intense debate. Though definitive explanations would come only decades later, the seeds of modern climate science were planted during these early inquiries. Observers recognized for the first time that the world was intimately interconnected, that an eruption in a distant corner of the globe could dim the sun and starve nations' oceans away.
Artists, inspired by the strange skies and haunting moods of 1816, carried the year's imagery into their work. The fiery sunsets that had unsettled the world found their way onto canvases, influencing entire movements. Writers continued exploring themes of creation, destruction, and the fragility of life, enriched by the atmosphere of the year that had seemed to suspend the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. The darkness of 1816 had not extinguished creativity.
It had ignited it. As time passed, the memory of the year without a summer entered the collective consciousness as a near-mythic event. Families recounted stories of snow falling in June, of dim days spent huddled inside, of harvests that never came. Historians chronicled the famine, the migrations, and the strange glow of the sky. The year became a symbol of nature's power, an unforgettable reminder that the sun, seasons, and weather were not guarantees, but gifts. And yet, the return of the sun brought with it an equally powerful message: healing. The earth, wounded by ash and shadow, had found its balance again. The sky had cleared. The birds had returned. The fields were beginning to flourish. Humanity, humbled and changed, had survived. In the end, the year without a summer was more than a natural disaster. It was a rare moment when the entire planet felt the same chill, feared the same dimness, and faced the same uncertainty. It revealed the fragility of civilization and the resilience of the human spirit. It left scars, yes, but also wisdom. And as the sun regained its strength, humanity stepped out from the shadow of the volcano, ready to rebuild, ready to adapt, and ready to remember. For the sky, though wounded, had finally brightened again.